The conference room fell silent except for the sharp click of Patricia's designer heels against the marble floor. She circled the table where I sat, my hands folded carefully in my lap, trying to maintain the composure I'd spent 20 years building in corporate America. My father, Donald, sat at the head of the table in his own home, watching with the blank expression of a man who'd long ago chosen comfort over courage. Patricia stopped behind my chair, and I felt her presence like ice against my spine. "You know, Donald," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I've been thinking about Rebecca's situation, living here rent-free while the rest of us contribute. It doesn't seem quite fair, does it?" The words hung in the air like poison. This was my childhood home. The house where my mother had planted roses every spring before cancer stole her away. The house where Michael and I had celebrated our wedding reception in the backyard. Where my father had walked me down a path lined with white ribbons and promised he'd always be there. That promise felt like ash in my mouth now. I looked at my father, waiting for him to speak, to defend me, to remember who I was before Patricia entered our lives with her country club memberships and her barely concealed contempt for anyone she deemed beneath her station. But Donald simply adjusted his reading glasses and studied the papers in front of him, as if they contained the secrets of the universe. The silence stretched, and in that moment, I understood with brutal clarity that I was utterly alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started differently. I'd woken in the guest bedroom of my father's Edina house, the weak January sunlight filtering through curtains my mother had sewn by hand 30 years ago. Everything in this room carried her memory, from the quilt she'd pieced together during my high school years to the photographs on the dresser showing our family when it was whole and unbroken. I'd moved back here 6 months ago, after Michael's sudden death left me reeling. A heart attack at 48. One moment he was laughing at something on television, the next he was gone, and I was a widow trying to understand how life could change in the space between heartbeats. The corporate world I'd climbed so carefully suddenly felt meaningless. Anderson and Whitmore Consulting had been my kingdom for 2 decades. I'd started as a junior analyst fresh out of the University of Minnesota, surviving in a male-dominated firm through sheer determination and an ability to outwork everyone around me. Michael had supported every late night, every missed dinner, every sacrifice I made to prove I belonged in those glass-walled offices overlooking downtown Minneapolis. Together, we'd built a life of careful planning and quiet success. No children by choice. We'd wanted freedom, wanted to travel, wanted to pour our energy into careers we loved and a partnership that felt unshakable. His death had revealed how fragile that foundation truly was. I'd taken a leave of absence from the firm, something I'd never done in 20 years. My father had insisted I come stay with him, said the big house felt empty anyway, said family should be together during hard times. I'd accepted, grateful for the illusion of safety, not yet understanding that Patricia viewed my presence as a threat to her carefully constructed domain. She'd married my father 3 years ago. A whirlwind romance that began at the Minnetonka Club and culminated in a wedding that cost more than my entire college education. My mother had been gone for 5 years by then, and I tried to be happy for Donald, tried to believe he deserved companionship in his retirement years. But Patricia had never wanted a family. She'd wanted a lifestyle. And my father's comfortable pension and paid-off house provided exactly that. The first few months of my stay had been tolerable. Patricia maintained a veneer of sympathy, making appropriate sounds about my loss while carefully avoiding any actual emotional labor. But as weeks turned to months, her patience wore thin. She began making small comments about my extended leave, about the job market, about how important it was for professional women to maintain their independence. The subtext was clear even when the words remained polite. I was overstaying my welcome in my own childhood home. I'd returned to work a month ago, easing back into my role as senior consultant. The firm had been accommodating, understanding that grief doesn't follow a schedule. My projects were still there waiting, my clients relieved to have me back. My assistant Jennifer managing everything with the quiet efficiency that had made her invaluable over the past 8 years. But something had shifted. The fire that once drove me to excel, to compete, to prove myself felt extinguished. I went through the motions, delivered the expected results, and felt nothing but exhaustion. That morning, I dressed carefully in the charcoal suit Michael had always said made me look unstoppable. I'd applied makeup with practiced precision, creating the mask of competence and control that corporate America demanded. I'd driven through snow-lined streets to the office, sat through meetings, reviewed reports, and returned emails with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Jennifer had brought me coffee without being asked, had quietly rearranged my afternoon to give me breathing room, had demonstrated the kind of intuitive care that made me grateful for her presence. The day had been ordinary until I'd returned to my father's house that evening. The moment I walked through the door, I sensed something was wrong. Patricia stood in the foyer wearing cream-colored slacks and a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was styled in the severe bob she favored, every strand in place, every detail controlled. My father sat in the living room, and the formality of the scene immediately put me on guard. This wasn't casual. This was staged. "Rebecca, we need to talk," Patricia said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone used to getting her way. "Please join us in the dining room." The dining room had always been reserved for special occasions in my childhood. Birthday dinners, holiday gatherings, celebrations that mattered. Using it now felt like a deliberate choice, a way of lending weight to whatever was about to happen. I followed them, my stomach tightening with each step. The table was clear except for a manila folder positioned precisely at what had apparently been designated as my seat. Patricia gestured toward it as if offering a gift. "Please sit down. Your father and I have prepared something we think will help clarify expectations going forward." Sat, and that's when the nightmare truly began. The folder contained several typed pages, formatted like a legal document. The header read, "Household Financial Responsibility Agreement." My name was listed at the top, followed by itemized expenses that made my breath catch. Mortgage payment, property taxes, utilities, groceries, maintenance, insurance. Every cost associated with running the household, divided into 3 equal portions. Patricia slid into the chair across from me, her expression pleasant and reasonable, as if we were discussing something as mundane as dinner plans. "Now, I know this might seem formal, but Donald and I believe in transparency. We've calculated all household expenses and divided them equally among the 3 adults living here. It only seems fair that everyone contributes proportionally." I stared at the numbers, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. $1,200 per month. That was my assigned portion for living in my childhood home, in the house my parents had purchased 40 years ago, in the space where my mother's memory still lingered in every corner. "This house is paid off," I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady despite the rage building in my chest. "There is no mortgage payment." Patricia's smile didn't waver. "Well, there are always costs, Rebecca. Upkeep, improvements, the general expense of maintaining a property of this size. We're simply asking that you participate in those costs like any responsible adult would." I looked at my father, willing him to meet my eyes, to acknowledge the absurdity of what was happening. Donald cleared his throat, finally speaking for the first time since I'd entered the room. "Patricia makes a good point, Becca. You're back on your feet now, working again. It's reasonable to expect you to chip in." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This man had held me when I cried over my mother's death. He'd walked me down the aisle to marry Michael. He'd called me every week after the funeral to check on me, had insisted I shouldn't be alone, had promised his home was my home for as long as I needed. And now he sat there hiding behind his newspaper and his new wife's cruelty, pretending this was about fairness rather than what it really was. Patricia wanted me gone, and my father lacked the spine to stand up to her. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to not react in the way they clearly expected. Years of corporate negotiations had taught me the value of controlling the room, of never letting them see you break. "I'll need time to review this," I said, closing the folder and standing up. My legs felt unsteady, but I kept my shoulders straight, my expression neutral. Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd expected tears or anger. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some emotional display she could use as evidence of my instability. Instead, I gave her nothing. I walked upstairs to my room, each step measured and deliberate. Only when the door closed behind me did I allow my hands to shake. I sat on the edge of my mother's quilt and stared at the folder I'd carried up with me, the weight of it somehow heavier than mere paper should be. This wasn't about money. Patricia earned nothing. She'd never worked a day in the 3 years since marrying my father, content to spend his retirement income on tennis lessons and spa days while I'd built a career through decades of 80-hour weeks and sacrificed weekends. This was about power, about establishing dominance, about making it clear that I existed in this house only at her sufferance. I thought about Michael, about how he would have reacted to this scene. He would have been furious, would have insisted we leave immediately, would have reminded me that I didn't need anyone's charity or tolerance. Michael had always believed in my strength, even when I doubted it myself. We'd built our life together through careful planning and shared goals. The house we'd purchased in the Lowry Hill neighborhood had been our pride. A restored Victorian we'd renovated ourselves over 5 years of weekends and sweat equity. Every room held memories of Michael on a ladder painting trim, of me tiling the bathroom floor, of shared visions becoming reality through stubborn persistence. That house sat empty now, too full of ghosts for me to bear living there alone. I'd locked the door 6 months ago and hadn't returned, couldn't face the silence that would greet me in rooms that once held laughter and music and the comfortable noise of a life shared. My father had offered his home, and I'd accepted, grateful to escape the memories. But I'd traded one kind of pain for another. At least grief was honest. This calculated humiliation dressed up as reasonable household management was something far more toxic. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank accounts, something I'd been avoiding since Michael's death. The numbers on the screen told a story I'd forgotten in my fog of mourning. Our life insurance policies, the payout from Michael's company benefits, the savings we'd accumulated through years of dual professional incomes and minimal extravagance, the investment accounts we'd built methodically, month after month, preparing for a retirement we'd planned to spend traveling to all the places we dreamed about. Michael would never see those places, but the money remained sitting in accounts I'd barely touched, a ghost of futures that would never materialize. The total made my breath catch. Even after funeral expenses and settling Michael's affairs, there was more than enough. More than enough to leave this house tonight if I wanted. More than enough to reclaim my independence and prove that Patricia's power existed only because I'd been too grief-stricken to recognize my own. I thought about the house in Lowry Hill, about whether I was ready to face those memories, or whether the weight of Michael's absence would crush me the moment I walked through that door. The Victorian sat on a tree-lined street where neighbors knew each other's names, where summer evenings meant gathering on front porches, where I'd felt a sense of community I'd never found in my father's more formal suburb. But there was another option, one that had been germinating in my mind even before tonight's theatrical display of household accounting. The corporate apartment. Anderson and Whitmore maintained several properties for visiting clients and consultants on extended projects. As a senior member of the firm, I had access to these spaces, could arrange a temporary residence while I figured out my next move. It would be neutral territory, untainted by either Patricia's hostility or Michael's memory. A place to breathe and plan without the weight of expectation or loss pressing down on every decision. I closed the laptop and looked around the room that had been mine as a teenager, then a guest room, and now felt like nothing more than temporary shelter in hostile territory. My mother's photographs smiled at me from their frames, frozen in moments when our family had been whole. I wondered what she would think of the man her husband had become, how easily he'd allowed his new wife to erase the life they'd built together, how quickly comfort had replaced character. The night stretched ahead, sleepless and full of calculations that had nothing to do with household budgets and everything to do with survival. I'd survived losing my mother, survived building a career in spaces that didn't want women to succeed, survived Michael's death when breathing itself felt like betrayal. I would survive this too. But survival, I was beginning to understand, wasn't enough anymore. The time had come to reclaim not just independence but dignity. And that required a plan executed with the same ruthless efficiency I brought to corporate strategy sessions. Patricia wanted a negotiation about household finances. She had no idea she just declared war on someone who'd spent 2 decades learning how to win battles against opponents far more sophisticated than a country club socialite with delusions of authority. I opened the folder again, this time reading each line with clinical detachment, noting every inflated figure and creative accounting choice. the mortgage payment that didn't exist, the property tax calculation that seemed double the actual county assessment, the utility estimates that bore no relationship to reality. This wasn't a household budget. It was a ransom demand wrapped in spreadsheet formatting. Tomorrow morning I would make phone calls, not to argue with Patricia or plead with my father, but to set in motion a series of moves they wouldn't see coming until it was far too late to counter. I would reclaim my life, but I would do it with the cold precision of someone who'd finally stopped hoping for family loyalty and started relying on the only thing that had never betrayed me: my own strategic mind. The game had begun, and Patricia had made the fatal mistake of assuming her opponent was still the grief-shattered woman who'd arrived on this doorstep 6 months ago, desperate for shelter and support. That woman was gone. What remained was something far more dangerous: a professional who'd been reminded why she'd fought so hard to succeed in the first place. Because in the end, power wasn't given as a gift. It was taken by those strong enough to claim it. The next morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes Minneapolis feel like a punishment. I dressed in layers, choosing a navy suit that Michael had once said made me look like I could negotiate peace treaties. The irony wasn't lost on me. I wasn't seeking peace. I was preparing for calculated warfare, the kind conducted in boardrooms and law offices where emotions were weaknesses to be exploited and facts were weapons to be deployed with surgical precision. I left the house before my father or Patricia stirred, grateful to avoid the performance of normalcy that breakfast would have required. The drive downtown took me past the familiar landmarks of a city I'd called home my entire life. Lake of the Isles lay frozen and pristine under fresh snow, the walking paths empty in the pre-dawn darkness. I jogged those paths countless times with Michael, our breath-forming clouds in the winter air while we debated everything from politics to where we should try for dinner. Those conversations felt like artifacts from another life. Evidence of a person I'd been before loss had stripped away every assumption about permanence and security. Anderson and Whitmore occupied floors 12 through 17 of the IDS Center, the Crystal Cathedral of Minneapolis's skyline. I'd always loved arriving early, before the offices filled with the ambient noise of ringing phones and overlapping conversations. In these quiet hours, the city spread below my window like a promise, all glass and steel and ambition rendered in morning light. I'd spent so many early mornings here, preparing presentations, reviewing contracts, building the reputation that had made me indispensable to the firm's most demanding clients. That reputation had survived my leave of absence, had been waiting for me when I returned like a coat I'd hung in the closet and could slip back into whenever needed. Jennifer was already at her desk when I arrived, steam rising from the coffee mug she cradled in both hands. She looked up with the kind of smile that suggested genuine affection rather than professional obligation, something I'd come to value more than I could easily express. In 8 years, she'd evolved from an assistant to a confidant, someone who anticipated my needs before I articulated them and ran interference with the efficiency of a trained diplomat. She was 32, sharp as broken glass, and possessed the kind of organizational mind that could juggle 15 competing priorities without breaking a sweat. "You're here early," she said, glancing at the clock that showed barely past 6. "Couldn't sleep or didn't want to?" The question was casual, but I heard the concern underneath. Jennifer had been the first person I'd called after Michael died, even before my father. She'd arrived at the hospital within an hour, had sat with me through the paperwork and decisions, had helped me navigate the bureaucracy of death without once offering platitudes about time healing wounds or Michael being in a better place. She'd simply been present, and that presence had mattered more than any words could have. "Family breakfast didn't appeal to me this morning," I said, hanging my coat on the hook behind my door. "I need you to pull some files for me." Quietly. Jennifer set down her coffee and reached for her notepad, her expression shifting into the focused attention that meant she understood this was important. "What kind of files?" "Property records for the house in Edina. My father's address. I need to know the ownership history, the current deed holder, any liens or encumbrances, tax assessment records for the past 10 years. I paused, considering how much to reveal. Jennifer had earned my trust repeatedly, but some vulnerabilities still felt too raw to expose. "There's a situation developing. I need information before I make any decisions." She didn't ask for details, didn't pry into the personal territory I was clearly marking as sensitive. Instead, She made notes in the shorthand she'd developed, a hybrid of symbols and abbreviations that made her record-keeping look like code. I can have that by noon. Anything else? I thought about Patricia's carefully formatted household budget, about my father's silence, about the trap they'd constructed with such transparent malice. I want you to schedule a meeting with Richard Bennett. Today if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest. Tell him it's personal legal consultation, not firm business. And Jennifer, this stays between us. Her eyes met mine and I saw understanding flicker there. She knew Richard as well as I did. He'd been Anderson and Whitmore's senior counsel for 15 years, a man whose expertise in estate planning and property law had made him invaluable to our wealthiest clients. He was also someone I'd worked beside on dozens of cases, someone whose discretion was absolute and whose loyalty, once earned, was unshakable. I'll make it happen, Jennifer said simply. And Rebecca? Whatever you're dealing with, I'm here. You know that. The kindness in her voice nearly undid me. I'd spent so long maintaining professional distance, keeping personal catastrophes separate from corporate performance, that genuine concern felt almost foreign. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without emotion creeping into my voice, and retreated into my office before gratitude could morph into tears. The morning passed in a blur of conference calls and client deliverables, the familiar rhythm of corporate problem-solving providing a temporary refuge from the personal crisis brewing in my father's house. I reviewed market analysis for a retail client considering expansion, provided strategic recommendations for a manufacturing firm navigating supply chain disruptions, and participated in a video conference with investors who needed reassurance about quarterly projections. The work was mindless in the best way, requiring just enough focus to crowd out the rage and hurt that kept threatening to surface. At 11:30, Jennifer appeared in my doorway with a thick folder. "Property records," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "And Richard can see you at 2 this afternoon. I blocked your calendar for the rest of the day and told everyone you're working on a confidential project." I took the folder and gestured for her to sit. She folded herself into one of the leather chairs facing my desk, her expression carefully neutral as I opened the file and began reading. The documents told a story I'd half suspected, but seeing it in black and white still sent fury coursing through my veins. The house in Edina had been purchased in 1978 by Donald and Margaret Hartman, my parents, for $65,000. A mortgage had been paid off in full by 1996. Upon my mother's death, the property had transferred entirely to my father through rights of survivorship. So far, nothing surprising. But then, 3 months after my father's marriage to Patricia, a quitclaim deed had been filed transferring half ownership to Patricia Hartman. My father had given away half of my mother's house to a woman he'd known less than a year, without consulting me, without considering that this house represented the only tangible legacy of the woman who'd raised me. The property tax assessments showed the house was currently valued at $480,000. Not a fortune by modern standards, but substantial enough to represent real equity. If my father died, Patricia would inherit his half, giving her 3/4 ownership. Unless, of course, he'd updated his will to give her everything, which seemed entirely possible given his apparent willingness to prioritize her comfort over any loyalty to his daughter or his first wife's memory. "This is worse than I thought," I said, more to myself than to Jennifer. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. "Do you want to tell me what's happening?" I considered the question. Part of me wanted to maintain the professional boundary, to keep personal disaster separate from workplace relationships. But another part, the part that was so tired of carrying everything alone, wanted to share the burden with someone who might actually understand. "Patricia presented me with a household budget last night," I began, the words coming slowly at first, then faster as anger fueled the narrative. "She wants me to pay $1,200 a month to live in my childhood home. The house that's paid off. The house my mother decorated and maintained and loved. She's itemizing expenses that don't exist and demanding I contribute like I'm some kind of tenant instead of family." Jennifer's expression darkened. "She's trying to force you out." It wasn't a question. She grasped the situation immediately, seeing through to the core motivation with the clarity that made her so effective. My father just sat there and let it happen. Didn't defend me, didn't question her numbers, didn't acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, There's something grotesque about charging your widowed daughter rent 6 months after her husband's funeral. The bitterness in my voice surprised me. I'd been maintaining such careful control, but speaking the truth aloud cracked something open. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, her fingers drumming lightly on the chair's armrest. When she spoke, her tone was thoughtful rather than sympathetic, strategic rather than emotional. What are you going to do? It was the right question, the one that shifted focus from hurt feelings to concrete action. I appreciated her for asking it. I'm going to make sure I understand all my options before I do anything. That's why I need to see Richard. I need to know where I stand legally, what rights I have, what moves I can make that won't blow up in my face. I paused, considering whether to voice the thought that had been forming since last night. And I need to figure out my housing situation. I can't stay in that house, not with Patricia making it clear I'm unwelcome and my father too cowardly to stand up for basic decency. Jennifer nodded slowly, and I could see her mind working through possibilities. The corporate apartments, she said. We have 2 vacant right now. The one on Marquette Avenue just opened up last week when the Seattle team finished their project. It's a 2-bedroom, furnished, available for as long as you need it. The suggestion was perfect, and I wondered how long she'd been considering it. Can you put me down for it? Indefinitely? She was already typing notes into her phone. Consider it done. I'll handle the paperwork this afternoon. You can move in this weekend if you want. Relief washed over me, immediate and physical. Place to go. Neutral territory where I could think and plan without Patricia's hostility poisoning every breath. Thank you, I said, and meant it with an intensity that went beyond professional gratitude. Jennifer stood to leave, then paused at the door. Rebecca, I don't know your stepmother and I don't need to. But I know you. And anyone who thinks they can diminish you or make you feel small has seriously miscalculated. You're going to be fine. Better than fine. She left before I could respond, pulling the door closed with a soft click. I sat alone with the property records spread across my desk, evidence of betrayals both legal and emotional. Patricia had gotten my father to sign away half of my mother's legacy. She'd moved into my childhood home and methodically erased every trace of the woman who'd actually built that life. And now she was trying to erase me too, to push me out with the calculated cruelty of someone who viewed family as competition rather than connection. But Patricia had made assumptions that were about to prove catastrophically wrong. She'd assumed I was broken by grief, vulnerable, dependent on my father's goodwill and too emotionally fragile to fight back. She'd assumed that because I'd stayed quiet during her various slights and microaggressions over the past months, I would continue to accept whatever treatment she decided to dish out. She'd assumed that my professional success was irrelevant to domestic dynamics, that corporate Rebecca was somehow separate from the daughter she could bully in her own home. Every assumption was wrong. Grief hadn't broken me. It had stripped away the illusions I'd carried about family loyalty and unconditional love, burned through the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about blood being thicker than water. What remained after that burning was clarity, cold and sharp as January ice. I knew exactly who my father had chosen to be. I knew exactly how much Patricia's manufactured concern was worth. And I knew with absolute certainty that I was done accepting treatment I would never tolerate in any other context. The afternoon stretched ahead, and I used the time to prepare for my meeting with Richard. I pulled financial documents from the secure files I maintained, records of everything Michael and I had built together. Our marriage had been a partnership in every sense, financial decisions made jointly, assets accumulated through combined effort and shared goals. The life insurance payout sat in a money market account, untouched since the check had cleared. Michael's retirement accounts had transferred to me as beneficiary, a substantial sum that represented decades of his careful planning and disciplined saving. The house in Lowry Hill was titled in both our names, and upon his death, it had transferred entirely to me through joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. The mortgage was small, less than $100,000 remaining on a property worth at least $600,000 in the current market. I owned that house free and clear of anyone's interference. Patricia had no claim on it. My father had no say in what I did with it. It was mine, earned through years of Michael's labor and my own. Proof that we'd built something real and lasting even if he hadn't lived to enjoy it with me. I'd been avoiding that house because the memories hurt too much, because walking into rooms where Michael should have been felt like torture. But maybe avoidance had been the wrong strategy. Maybe reclaiming that space was exactly what I needed. A way to honor what we'd built rather than running from it. Beyond the house, there were investment accounts we'd funded systematically, retirement savings that would let me walk away from Anderson and Whitmore tomorrow if I chose, though I had no intention of doing so. Work provided structure, purpose, a reason to maintain the routines that kept depression from swallowing me whole. But knowing I could leave, that I was financially independent and beholden to no one, that knowledge carried its own power. I assembled copies of everything, organized in the methodical way that had served me well throughout my career. Documentation was power. Facts were weapons. And I was about to arm myself for the fight Patricia had been foolish enough to start. At 2 o'clock precisely, I walked 3 blocks through the Skyway system to Richard Bennett's office. He practiced with a boutique firm that specialized in estate planning, the kind of white shoe establishment that occupied understated space and charged fees that made most people wince. Richard himself was in his late 50s, silver-haired and perpetually calm, with the bearing of someone who'd seen every variety of family dysfunction and retained the capacity to be surprised by none of it. He rose when I entered, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "Rebecca, good to see you." Jennifer was mysterious about the purpose of this meeting, which of course made me intensely curious. I settled into the chair across from his desk, a massive piece of mahogany that suggested gravitas and permanence. His office looked out over Loring Park, currently blanketed in snow, the trees stark and beautiful against white ground. "I need legal advice about a family situation," I began, deciding directness was the best approach. "My father remarried 3 years ago. I've been staying with him since my husband died. And now my stepmother has presented me with what she's calling a household financial responsibility agreement." Richard's expression didn't change, but I saw his attention sharpen. "I see. Do you have a copy of this agreement?" I pulled the folder from my bag and slid it across the desk. He opened it and began reading, his eyes moving methodically down the page. The silence stretched for several minutes while he absorbed the contents. When he finally looked up, his expression was carefully controlled, but I caught a flicker of something that might have been discussed. "This is interesting," he said, choosing his words with the precision of someone who dealt in legal implications rather than emotional reactions. "Tell me about the property in question. Who holds title?" I handed him the property records Jennifer had pulled. He studied them with the same careful attention, and I watched his eyebrows rise slightly when he reached the quitclaim deed transferring half ownership to Patricia. "Your father gave her half the house 3 months after the marriage," he observed. "That's remarkably fast for such a significant transfer. Was this discussed with you beforehand?" "I found out about it today when I pulled the records," I said flatly. "My father didn't think it necessary to mention that he was giving away half of my mother's house to a woman he barely knew." Richard made a note on the legal pad in front of him, his handwriting the same careful script I'd seen on countless documents over the years. "And your mother's estate? How was that handled upon her death?" "Everything went to my father. They'd structured it that way intentionally, assuming he would survive her and wanting to avoid probate. The house, their savings, everything transferred to him automatically." I could hear the bitterness creeping into my voice and tried to moderate it. She trusted him to honor her memory, to preserve what they'd built together. Instead, he handed half of it to Patricia before the marriage was even a year old. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of his face. "Here's the legal reality, Rebecca. As half owner of the property, Patricia has certain rights. She can't unilaterally evict you, but she can make living there uncomfortable enough that you choose to leave. This household agreement she's proposing has no legal force. You could refuse to sign it, refuse to pay anything, and she'd have limited recourse. At most, she could try to establish that you're a tenant and pursue eviction through the courts, but that would be ugly, expensive, and uncertain." "So I have rights," I said, wanting confirmation. "But exercising them would mean constant conflict." He nodded. "Exactly. You could dig in and fight her, make her work for every inch of ground. But the question you need to ask yourself is whether that's the battle you want. Is living in that house worth the daily warfare it would require?" The question hit home because I've been asking myself the same thing since last night. No, I admitted. I don't want to live there anymore. I don't want to see my father choose her over me every single day. I don't want to breathe air that's poisoned with her resentment and his cowardice. Richard's expression softened slightly, the lawyer giving way momentarily to the human being underneath. Then you're making the right choice by leaving. But I assume you're here because you want to do it strategically, not just pack a bag and storm out. I want options, I said. I want to understand what power I have in this situation, what moves I can make that will protect me and maybe, just maybe, make them realize they can't treat people this way without consequences. He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him and began writing, his pen moving in quick, decisive strokes. Let's talk about your assets. You mentioned your husband passed away. What's your current financial situation? I walked him through everything. The life insurance payout, Michael's retirement accounts, the house in Lowry Hill, our investment portfolio. The picture that emerged was one of substantial security, more than enough to live independently without any concern about income or housing. Richard's expression remained professional, but I saw approval in his eyes. Michael and I had planned well, had built a foundation that could weather even his unexpected death. You're in an enviable position, Richard said when I'd finished. You don't need your father's house, you don't need his financial support, and you don't need to accept treatment that diminishes you. You have leverage here, Rebecca. The question is how you want to use it. I considered the question. Part of me wanted to simply disappear, to move into the corporate apartment and never speak to my father or Patricia again. Let them have their house and their carefully divided expenses. Let them enjoy the life they'd chosen without me cluttering up their perfect country club existence. But another part, the part that had spent 20 years fighting for respect in boardrooms full of men who'd assumed I didn't belong, that part wanted something more. Not revenge exactly, but accountability. Recognition that their behavior had consequences, that you couldn't treat people as disposable and expect no repercussions. I want them to understand what they've lost, I said slowly, the thought forming as I spoke. I want my father to look at the choices he's made and recognize that he traded his daughter for a woman who sees him as a retirement plan. I want Patricia to realize that I'm not some weak, grief-stricken woman she can bully out of the house. I'm someone who built a successful career through intelligence and determination, and I don't accept disrespect from anyone. Richard smiled, a small quirk of his lips that suggested satisfaction. Then I have some suggestions. But first, tell me about this house in Lowry Hill. Are you ready to return to it, or would you prefer to keep that separate from this situation? The question struck at the heart of my ambivalence. That house held Michael in every room, in the kitchen where he'd cooked elaborate Sunday dinners, in the study where we'd worked side by side on our respective projects, in the bedroom where we'd shared 30 years of intimacy and trust. Going back there would mean confronting his absence in the most immediate way possible. But maybe that confrontation was overdue. Maybe I'd been hiding in my father's house not just because he'd offered shelter, but because it let me avoid the harder work of learning to live in the space Michael and I had created together. Maybe reclaiming that house was part of reclaiming myself, proof that grief didn't have to mean abandoning everything we'd built. I think I'm ready, I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. Or at least I'm ready to try. I can always move to the corporate apartment if it's too much. But that house is mine. We bought it, we renovated it, we made it beautiful. Patricia doesn't get to chase me away from my own property. Richard made notes, his expression thoughtful. Good. Then here's what I'd suggest. First, secure your housing immediately. Move into your own home this weekend. Make it clear you're leaving not because you're defeated, but because you're choosing something better. Second, sit down with your father and have a conversation about his estate planning. Ask him directly about his will, about what provisions he's made for Patricia versus any legacy for you. Make him confront the implications of his choices. He'll refuse to discuss it, I said, knowing my father's preference for avoiding difficult conversations. He'll say it's morbid or inappropriate or none of my business. Richard shrugged. Then his refusal becomes information in itself. But I suspect once you're no longer living in his house, once you've demonstrated that you're not dependent on his approval or his roof over your head, he might be more willing to engage. People respect strength, Rebecca. Even people who should love you unconditionally often respect strength more than they honor relationship. The cynicism in his words resonated with my own growing understanding. I'd spent months trying to be the good daughter, the grieving widow who didn't make waves, the houseguest who stayed out of the way and caused no trouble. And it had earned me nothing except Patricia's contempt and my father's complicity. What else? I asked, wanting the full strategic picture. Document everything, Richard said. Keep copies of that household agreement, any emails or written communications from Patricia or your father. If this situation escalates, if they try to claim you owe them money or that you damaged their property or any other nonsense people invent when family conflicts explode, you'll need evidence. Also, I'd recommend you review your own estate planning. Make sure your will, your beneficiaries, all of it reflects your current reality and your actual wishes, not assumptions about family loyalty that may no longer apply. The weekend arrived with the kind of harsh clarity that comes after sleepless nights spent making decisions you can't unmake. I'd spent the past 3 days moving through my father's house like a ghost, speaking only when absolutely necessary, watching Patricia and Donald go about their routines as if nothing had changed. They seemed relieved by my silence, interpreting it as acceptance rather than what it actually was. Strategic withdrawal before a calculated strike. Friday evening. I'd packed my belongings with methodical precision. Every item that mattered fit into 6 boxes and 3 suitcases, a reminder of how little I'd actually brought to this house 6 months ago. Most of my life with Michael remained in storage or sitting untouched in the Lowry Hill house. I'd been living like a refugee in my own childhood home, keeping my presence minimal, making myself small enough that maybe Patricia wouldn't notice me taking up space. That kind of accommodation ended now. Jennifer had arranged for movers to meet me Saturday morning at 9. Professional, discreet, the kind of service that handled executive relocations without asking questions. I'd given her the Lowry Hill address, and she'd simply nodded, updating her files without commentary. That restraint, that understanding of when to speak and when to simply facilitate, was part of what made her invaluable. She knew this move represented more than changing addresses. It was reclamation, return, a refusal to let grief or family dysfunction determine where I belonged. The sun hadn't fully risen when I carried the first box downstairs. The house was quiet, both Patricia and my father still sleeping behind their closed bedroom door. I felt a flash of bitter satisfaction knowing they'd wake to find me gone, my room empty, no note of explanation or apology. They'd wanted me out. They were getting their wish, just not in the way they'd imagined. Not with me defeated and desperate, but with me choosing something better and leaving them to their carefully budgeted existence. The movers arrived precisely on time, 2 men who handled my belongings with the efficient care of people who did this every day. They loaded the truck quickly while I did a final walkthrough of the guest room that had been mine. The quilt my mother had sewn still lay across the bed. I ran my hand over it one last time, remembering her fingers working the needle, her patience with each stitch. She'd made beautiful things, had filled this house with evidence of her care and creativity. Patricia had covered most of it with her own preferred aesthetic, sleek and modern and devoid of personality, but traces of my mother remained if you knew where to look. I folded the quilt carefully and added it to my belongings. My mother would have wanted me to have it, would have understood why I couldn't stay in this house that no longer held any warmth or welcome. She'd raised me to be strong, to stand up for myself, to never accept mistreatment just because it came wrapped in the language of family obligation. I could almost hear her voice in my head, firm and certain. You don't owe them your dignity, Rebecca. Not even your father. By 8:30, the truck was loaded and ready to depart. I followed it in my own car, driving through Edina's quiet streets toward the neighborhood Michael and I had chosen together 15 years ago. Lowry Hill sat just west of downtown, an enclave of Victorian homes and tree-lined boulevards that felt worlds away from the suburbs. We'd fallen in love with the area during one of our weekend explorations, walking through the neighborhood and imagining ourselves as part of its community. When the house came on the market, a neglected Victorian that needed everything, we'd stretched our budget and made an offer the same day. The renovation had taken 5 years of weekends and evenings. Every room a project we'd tackled together. Michael had learned plumbing by necessity when we'd gutted the bathrooms. I'd taught myself to strip woodwork, spending hours with chemical removers and sandpaper to reveal the original oak beneath decades of paint. We'd argued about paint colors, about whether to keep the pocket doors, about how much was too much to spend on historically accurate light fixtures. Those arguments had been part of the joy. Two people building something together through sweat and stubbornness and shared vision. I hadn't been back since the week after Michael's funeral, when I'd locked the door and fled to my father's house. Driving up now, seeing the turret rising against the winter sky, the wide front porch where we'd spent summer evenings, I felt my throat tighten. The house looked exactly the same, frozen in time like a photograph of a life that no longer existed. Snow covered the front walk, undisturbed since the last storm. No one had been here to shovel, to maintain, to care for the space we'd loved. The movers waited patiently while I stood on the sidewalk, key in hand, gathering the courage to cross the threshold. Jennifer had arranged for the utilities to be reconnected, for the heat to be turned up, for basic supplies to be delivered. The house would be livable, functional, even if it was haunted by memory and loss. I forced myself to move, to climb the porch steps and insert the key in the lock. The door swung open and I stepped into the foyer. Dust covered every surface, visible in the thin morning light filtering through the stained glass window above the door. The air smelled stale and closed, the scent of abandonment. But underneath I caught traces of what had been. The lemon oil we'd used on the woodwork. The specific mustiness of old houses in winter. Even, impossibly, a hint of Michael's cologne, though that was surely imagination rather than reality. No scent could linger 6 months without anyone to wear it. The movers brought boxes in while I walked through rooms that felt both familiar and foreign. The living room with its bay window overlooking the street. The built-in bookshelves Michael had constructed to my exact specifications. The dining room where we'd hosted countless dinner parties. Our friends gathering around the table we'd found at an estate sale and refinished together. The kitchen we'd gutted completely, installing the commercial range Michael had insisted we needed even though neither of us were professional cooks. Every room held memories layered so thick I could barely breathe beneath their weight. But the house also held proof of what I was capable of building. Every successful renovation, every problem we'd solved, every compromise we'd reached, it all testified to my ability to create something lasting and beautiful. Patricia could diminish me in my father's house, could make me feel small and unwelcome. But here, in the space Michael and I had transformed through sheer determination, I was reminded of my own strength. This house had been a disaster when we'd bought it. We'd made it extraordinary. That same capability existed in me now, even without Michael beside me. The bedroom was the hardest. Our bed, still made with the sheets I'd stripped and washed the morning of his death, hung fresh and crisp before driving him to what I'd thought was a routine doctor's appointment. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand beside a biography he'd never finish. His slippers were tucked under the edge of the bed, waiting for feet that would never slide into them again. I'd preserved everything like a shrine, unable to disturb the evidence of his existence. I stood in the doorway for a long time, letting the grief wash over me without trying to fight it. This was what I'd been avoiding, this confrontation with absence, this acknowledgement that Michael was gone and all the preservation in the world couldn't bring him back. The bedroom would have to be dealt with eventually, his clothes sorted, his possessions distributed to family or donated. But not today. Today was about reclaiming the house, about choosing to live here again despite the pain. The rest could come later, in smaller pieces I could manage without breaking. By noon, the movers had finished and departed. I stood in the living room surrounded by boxes, exhausted but also strangely energized. I'd done it. I'd left my father's house, moved back into my own space, taken the first step toward rebuilding a life that wasn't defined by grief or family obligation. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "How are you holding up? Need anything?" Her timing was impeccable as always, checking in without being intrusive. I typed back, "I'm okay. House feels empty but also right. Thank you for everything." Her response came immediately. "You're stronger than you think. Call if you need me." I set the phone down and looked around the room. The afternoon stretched ahead with no obligations, no schedule to keep, no Patricia watching my movements with thinly veiled disapproval. Just space and silence and the work of sorting through what remained. I started with the kitchen, unpacking dishes and groceries, establishing the basic rhythms of living. The refrigerator hummed to life, a sound that felt oddly comforting in its mundanity. I made coffee, real coffee from the espresso machine Michael had insisted we needed, and stood at the kitchen window watching neighbors walk dogs through the snow. This neighborhood had always felt alive in a way the suburbs never did. People knew each other here, stopped to chat on the sidewalk, organized block parties and community events. Michael and I had been part of that, had contributed to the neighborhood association, had shown up for park cleanups and holiday celebrations. I'd abandoned all of it when I'd fled to my father's house, too overwhelmed by loss to maintain any connections. But the neighborhood was still here, still functioning, and I could choose to rejoin it or remain isolated. The choice was mine. By late afternoon, I'd made significant progress unpacking. The kitchen was functional, the bathroom stocked with necessities, my bedroom set up in the guest room since I couldn't face sleeping in the room I'd shared with Michael. That felt like enough for one day, enough forward motion to count as victory. I was making dinner, something simple from the groceries Jennifer had arranged to have delivered, when my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for 3 rings, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to make him wonder and worry the way he'd made me feel uncertain and unwelcome. But curiosity won out. I wanted to hear what he'd say, how he'd explain coming home to find my room empty. I answered without greeting, just silence waiting for him to speak first. "Rebecca." His voice was tight, controlled in the way that meant he was angry but trying not to show it. "Where are you? Patricia said your room is empty." The fact that he led with Patricia's observation rather than his own concern told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. "I moved out," I said simply, keeping my tone neutral and factual. "You wanted me to contribute financially to the household. I decided it made more sense to live in my own house instead." Silence stretched across the line, and I could picture him standing in the kitchen, probably with Patricia hovering nearby listening to every word. "You could have discussed this with us," he said finally. "Just disappearing without a word is childish." The accusation stung precisely because it was so hypocritical. Like discussing property transfers before giving Patricia half of Mom's house? I replied, my voice still calm but edged with steel. Or discussing household budgets before presenting me with bills for a mortgage that doesn't exist. Which conversations exactly should I have initiated, Dad? I heard him exhale sharply, frustration evident even through the phone. That house is half Patricia's. She has every right to expect everyone living there to contribute to its upkeep. The defense came automatically, the script he'd clearly rehearsed with his wife. It didn't acknowledge anything I'd actually said, didn't address the fundamental dishonesty of their financial demands. It simply reiterated Patricia's position as if repetition made it more valid. "You're absolutely right," I said, and I could hear the surprise in his silence at my agreement. "She has every right to expect contribution from people living in her house. Which is why I'm not living there anymore." Problem solved. I kept my voice pleasant, almost cheerful, refusing to give him the emotional reaction he was probably expecting. "This is about more than money, Rebecca." Now he sounded uncertain, as if the conversation wasn't following the script he'd anticipated. "You're my daughter. You belong here." The words should have warmed me, should have felt like the acknowledgement of connection I'd been craving. Instead they rang hollow. I belonged in his house only if I paid rent and accepted diminishment. That wasn't belonging. That was tenancy with a biological connection. "I belong in my own home," I said quietly. "The one Michael and I built together. The one where I don't have to justify my presence or itemize my expenses. I'll be fine, Dad. Better than fine, actually." Another pause, longer this time. "Patricia is upset," he said finally. "She feels like you're making this harder than it needs to be." The statement was so absurd I nearly laughed. "Tell Patricia I'm sorry she's upset about me respecting her wishes by leaving. I'll try to be more considerate of her feelings in the future." The sarcasm was probably lost on him, or maybe he heard it and chose to ignore the challenge. "We should talk about this in person," he said. "Can you come to dinner tomorrow? We'll sort this out like adults." The offer was almost tempting. Part of me wanted to show up, to sit across the table from them and calmly explain every way they'd failed me. But I knew how that conversation would go. Patricia would twist everything, would make herself the victim of my unreasonable expectations. My father would mediate by taking her side, by prioritizing her comfort over any acknowledgement of how his daughter had been treated. I would leave feeling worse than before, my legitimate grievances dismissed as drama or oversensitivity. I don't think so, I said. I'm settling into my house, getting reacquainted with my own space. But thank you for the invitation. My politeness was armor, a way of maintaining control when every instinct wanted to scream at him about betrayal and cowardice, and choosing a woman he barely knew over the daughter he'd raised. Rebecca, please. Now his voice carried something that might have been genuine distress. Don't do this. Don't cut us out of your life over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? As if the problem was my interpretation rather than their actions. As if I'd somehow gotten confused about being presented with a rental agreement in my childhood home. I'm not cutting anyone out, I said, my patience fraying. I'm living in my own house. You're welcome to visit if you'd like to see it. But I'm done pretending that what happened was acceptable, or that I should be grateful for the privilege of paying rent to my own father. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The conversation had gone exactly as expected, which made it no less infuriating. My father was incapable of seeing beyond Patricia's narrative, incapable of questioning whether maybe, possibly, his new wife's treatment of his daughter crossed some fundamental line of decency. He'd chosen his side, and it wasn't mine. I set the phone down and returned to making dinner, channeling frustration into chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. The kitchen filled with the familiar sounds of cooking, the sizzle of garlic and olive oil, the bubble of water coming to boil. These were the sounds of home, of normalcy, of life continuing despite everything that had tried to break it. Michael and I had cooked together in this kitchen countless times, moving around each other with the choreographed ease of long partnership. I missed that, missed him, missed the certainty that someone was on my side unconditionally. But I was learning to be on my own side, to defend my own dignity with the same fierce protection I'd once reserved for others. Corporate negotiations had taught me never to accept the first offer, never to show weakness, never to let emotion cloud strategic thinking. Those same skills applied to family conflict, maybe even more so because the stakes felt more personal. Patricia had made an opening move by demanding rent. I'd countered by leaving entirely, removing myself from her sphere of control. Now she and my father were scrambling to respond, surprised that the grieving widow had turned out to be more formidable than they'd calculated. I ate dinner alone at the kitchen table, the silence broken only by the ticking of the antique clock Michael had restored. The house settled around me with the particular sounds of old buildings in winter, the creak of wood contracting in the cold, the whisper of wind finding gaps in century-old construction. These sounds had once been comforting, evidence of the house's character and history. Tonight they felt almost like companionship, the house itself welcoming me back after months of abandonment. After dinner, I unpacked books, filling the shelves Michael had built with the collection we'd accumulated over 30 years together. Each volume held memories, books we'd read aloud to each other on vacation, reference materials for various renovation projects, novels we'd argued about, agreeing on quality but disagreeing on interpretation. I arranged them without conscious system, letting my hands remember where each belonged through muscle memory and habit. The familiar task was meditative, requiring just enough attention to quiet the anger still churning from my father's call. By the time I finished, the bookshelves looked lived in again, evidence of occupation and care. I stepped back and examined my work, feeling a small surge of satisfaction. This was progress, tangible and visible. Tomorrow I would tackle more boxes, would continue the work of transforming the house from preserved memorial to functional home. But tonight I'd done enough. I'd moved back, I'd survived the first confrontation with my father, and I'd begun the process of reclaiming my space. I made tea and carried it into the living room, settling onto the sofa with a blanket and no plan beyond sitting quietly in my own house. My phone buzzed with another text, this time from a number I didn't immediately recognize. I opened it cautiously. Rebecca, it's Amanda from book club. Someone mentioned you might be back in the neighborhood? We'd love to see you at our next meeting if you're up for it. No pressure, just wanted you to know you're missed. The message hit harder than I'd expected. Amanda and I had been casual friends, the kind of connection forged through shared interests and proximity rather than deep emotional intimacy. Book club had been a monthly ritual, A group of neighborhood women gathering to discuss literature and, more honestly, to drink wine and gossip about local politics. I'd stopped going after Michael died, unable to face the sympathy and awkward condolences, unable to pretend everything was fine while drowning in grief. But the invitation now felt like a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. Evidence that I still existed in contexts beyond family drama and corporate performance. Amanda wasn't asking about my father or Patricia, wasn't expecting me to justify or explain anything. She simply wanted me to rejoin a community I'd abandoned. I typed back, "I'm back. Would love to come to the next meeting. Thanks for reaching out." Her response was immediate. "Next Thursday, 7 p.m. at Kate's house. Bring wine and opinions, we're doing Margaret Atwood." The casualness of it, the assumption that I could just show up and belong again, felt almost revolutionary after months of walking on eggshells in my father's house. Here was a space where my presence was wanted without conditions, where I could be Rebecca the reader and neighbor rather than Rebecca the disappointing daughter or Rebecca the tragic widow. I set the phone aside and sipped my tea, feeling something shift in my chest. Maybe this was what moving forward looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but small steps back into normal life. Unpacking books, accepting invitations, choosing to show up for communities that actually wanted me there. Patricia and my father could keep their itemized budgets and their comfortable lives. I would build something different, something authentic, something that honored both the life I'd shared with Michael and the life I was learning to construct alone. The evening deepened into night, and I stayed on the sofa, wrapped in my blanket, letting the house embrace me with its particular warmth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more boxes to unpack, more decisions about what to keep and what to release. But tonight I was home. Not hiding in my father's guest room, not camping in a corporate apartment, but home in the space I'd earned through years of work and love and stubborn determination. Patricia couldn't take this from me. My father couldn't undermine it with his disappointing choices. This house was mine, proof that I'd built something lasting, and no amount of family dysfunction could erase that accomplishment. I thought about Richard's advice about documenting everything and reviewing my estate planning. Monday morning I would schedule appointments, would set in motion the administrative work of protecting myself legally and financially. But tonight was for something simpler. For sitting in my own living room, drinking tea from my own cups, surrounded by books I'd chosen and memories I'd made. For recognizing that survival wasn't the same as surrender, that grief didn't require erasure, and that choosing myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. It was overdue. And it was finally possible. Monday morning arrived with the sharp brightness that follows fresh snowfall. I woke in the guest bedroom of my own house, momentarily disoriented before memory settled and I remembered where I was and why. The decision to sleep here rather than in the master bedroom had been practical rather than emotional, though both factors played their part. This room faced east, catching morning light that made waking easier. It also lacked the concentrated presence of Michael that saturated our former shared space, giving me breathing room while I adjusted to being back in the house. I dressed for work with more care than usual, choosing a charcoal suit that made me feel armored and professional. Today wasn't just another Monday at Anderson and Whitmore. Today I was returning to the office as someone who'd reclaimed her independence, who'd made strategic moves over the weekend that would reshape the landscape of my personal life. That transformation required presentation, required carrying myself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, even when uncertainty still churned beneath the surface. The drive downtown took me through neighborhoods slowly coming to life, coffee shops opening their doors, buses collecting commuters at familiar corners. Minneapolis in winter had a particular quality, the cold sharpening everything into high definition, making the skyline stand out against pale blue sky with almost painful clarity. I'd always loved this city, loved its combination of Midwestern practicality and unexpected sophistication, loved how it managed to feel both cosmopolitan and approachable. Michael and I had considered moving several times over the years, following job opportunities to supposedly better markets, but we'd always chosen to stay. This was home in ways that transcended simple geography. Jennifer was at her desk when I arrived, and her face brightened when she saw me. "You look different," she observed, studying me with the attention to detail that made her so effective. "Good different. Like you slept properly for the first time in months." I hadn't realized how visible my exhaustion had been until she pointed out its absence. The house was the right choice, I said, settling into my office and hanging up my coat. Hard but right. I'm back where I belong. She followed me in, closing the door behind her with the casual gesture that meant she wanted to talk privately. Your father called the office Friday afternoon, right after you'd left. Asked if I knew where you were going. I told him you'd mentioned working from home but didn't provide specifics. The information didn't surprise me. Of course, Donald had tried to track me down through work channels when I hadn't answered his calls. The attempt to circumvent my boundaries was exactly the kind of thing he'd do, unable to accept that I might legitimately need space from him and his wife. Thank you for not giving him details, I said, meaning it deeply. I know that put you in an awkward position. Jennifer shrugged, her expression suggesting she'd handled far more challenging situations. You're my boss and, more importantly, my friend. Your personal business is yours to share or not share as you choose. I'm not going to compromise that because someone's uncomfortable with boundaries. The solidarity in her words steadied something inside me. This was what actual support looked like, not the conditional acceptance my father offered where love came with price tags and fine print. I need to make some appointments today, I said, shifting into practical mode. Richard Bennett for estate planning follow-up. And I want to schedule a full financial review with our wealth management team. Everything Michael and I built together, I need to understand it completely and make sure it's structured to reflect my current situation. Jennifer was already taking notes, her fingers flying across her tablet. I'll set those up for this week if possible. Anything else? I considered the question. There was so much to manage, so many moving pieces in the reconstruction of my life. But one task rose to the surface as particularly important. I want you to research property management companies, reputable ones that handle residential rentals in the Lowry Hill area. I may need their services soon. Her eyebrows rose slightly, curiosity evident, but she didn't ask for explanation. I'll have a list by end of day, with reviews and fee structures. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of client work, the problems and solutions that constituted my professional expertise. I reviewed marketing strategies for a healthcare client, participated in a video conference about supply chain optimization, and drafted recommendations for a retail company considering expansion into new markets. The work was intellectually engaging without being emotionally taxing, providing the perfect distraction from personal turmoil while still allowing me to feel competent and valuable. At 11, Jennifer knocked and entered with her tablet. Richard can see you tomorrow at 10. I blocked your morning. And I've got 3 property management companies that look promising. Want me to set up consultations? I nodded, scanning the information she'd compiled. Each company had strong reviews, specialized in historic properties, and offered comprehensive services from tenant screening to maintenance coordination. Set up calls with all 3. I want to compare approaches before deciding. By early afternoon, I had appointments scheduled with each property management firm, a meeting with Richard Bennett to finalize estate planning updates, and a session with the wealth management team to review my complete financial picture. The calendar filled with concrete actions felt like progress, like taking control rather than simply reacting to circumstances. Patricia and my father had tried to make me feel small and dependent. I was systematically proving otherwise. Thursday evening arrived faster than I'd anticipated, the week consumed by work and administrative tasks related to restructuring my life. I'd spoken to my father twice more, brief conversations where he'd tried various approaches to convince me to return to his house. First came guilt, reminders of family obligation and how worried he was about me living alone. When that failed, he'd tried anger, suggesting I was being dramatic and childish. Finally, he'd attempted bargaining, offering to speak with Patricia about revising the household agreement to something more reasonable. I'd refused all of it with the same calm consistency, explaining each time that I was perfectly content in my own home and had no intention of returning to his. The repetition was exhausting but necessary. Donald needed to understand that this wasn't a temporary rebellion or a negotiating tactic. I'd made a permanent choice based on how I wanted to live and who I wanted to be. His approval or disapproval was irrelevant to that decision. Book club met at Kate's house, a beautifully restored craftsman just 4 blocks from my own place. I walked there through the cold evening, carrying a bottle of wine and the Margaret Atwood novel we'd been assigned. The streets were quiet, porch lights glowing warm against the darkness, the kind of neighborhood scene that had drawn Michael and me here originally. Community without intrusion, proximity without pressure. The perfect balance of connection and independence. Kate answered the door with a hug that lasted just long enough to feel genuine without becoming awkward. "Rebecca, I'm so glad you came. We've missed you." The warmth in her voice sounded authentic, and I felt tension I hadn't realized I was carrying begin to ease. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and baking, something with cinnamon that made my mouth water. 6 other women were already gathered, faces I recognized from dozens of previous meetings. They greeted me with hugs and smiles, with questions about how I was doing that felt more curious than intrusive. We settled into Kate's living room with wine and appetizers, the conversation flowing easily from neighborhood news to book discussion. Amanda asked about the themes of bodily autonomy in Atwood's work. Lisa connected the novel to current political debates. Karen argued about narrative structure, while the rest of us defended the author's choices. It was exactly the kind of engaged, intelligent conversation I'd been craving without realizing how much I'd missed it. Halfway through the evening, during a lull in book discussion, Amanda turned to me with careful kindness. "Someone mentioned you moved back to your house. How's that going?" The question could have felt invasive, but her tone made it clear I could answer or deflect as I chose. I decided on honesty, or at least a version of it. "It's been an adjustment. The house holds a lot of memories, but it also feels right to be back in a space that's actually mine." Kate nodded understanding. "I remember after my divorce, going back to the condo I'd lived in before marriage. Everything felt both familiar and completely different. Like I was the same person but also not. The comparison wasn't perfect, but the underlying sentiment resonated." "Exactly," I said. "I'm relearning how to be just myself rather than part of a couple. It's harder than I expected but also kind of liberating." The conversation shifted then. Other women sharing their own stories of transition and reinvention. Lisa talked about going back to school in her 40s. Karen described starting her business after years as a stay-at-home mother. Amanda mentioned her recent decision to leave a toxic workplace without having another job lined up. Each story was different in specifics but similar in theme. Women choosing themselves, taking risks, refusing to accept circumstances that diminished them. I listened, feeling a growing sense of kinship with these women I'd never discussed anything more personal than book preferences with. We were all navigating the complicated work of building lives that felt authentic rather than simply acceptable. We were all learning that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was disappoint people's expectations in favor of your own integrity. By the time I walked home that night, slightly wine-drunk and thoroughly content, I felt more hopeful than I had in months. This was community, real and sustaining. Not the obligatory connection of blood relation, but the chosen association of people who actually enjoyed each other's company and wanted each other to thrive. Patricia could never understand that kind of relationship because she viewed every interaction as transactional, every person as either useful or expendable. My father had forgotten it was possible, too comfortable in his isolated suburban existence to remember what genuine community felt like. But I was remembering. And in remembering, I was also recognizing how much I'd lost by retreating into grief and isolation. Michael wouldn't have wanted that for me. He'd always believed in engagement, in showing up, in being part of something larger than our private partnership. Returning to book club wasn't just about reading novels and drinking wine. It was about honoring his memory by living fully rather than simply surviving. Friday afternoon, Jennifer appeared in my doorway with an expression I'd learned to recognize as significant news. "Your father is in the lobby. He's asking to see you." The announcement sent a spike of anxiety through my chest. Donald had never come to my office uninvited, had always respected the boundary between my professional and personal life. His appearance here meant he was desperate or angry or both, willing to cross lines he'd previously honored. "Did he say what he wants?" I asked, buying time to compose myself. Jennifer shook her head. "Just that it's important and he needs to speak with you. I can tell him you're unavailable if you prefer." The offer was tempting. I could avoid the confrontation, send him away, maintain the distance I'd been carefully constructing. But avoidance solved nothing. If Donald was determined to have a conversation, He'd simply find another time and place. Better to handle it now, on my territory where I controlled the environment. Give me 5 minutes, then send him up, I said, making the decision quickly before doubt could take root. Jennifer nodded and disappeared. I used the time to clear my desk, to close files and put away anything that might suggest vulnerability or distraction. When Donald arrived, he would find me professional, composed, and firmly in control of my domain. He appeared exactly 5 minutes later, escorted by Jennifer, who gave me a questioning look before retreating and closing the door. My father looked older than I remembered, the stress of the past week evident in new lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore slacks and a sweater rather than business attire, suggesting he'd come directly from home without regard for downtown dress codes. "Rebecca," he began, then seemed unsure how to proceed. He stood awkwardly in front of my desk until I gestured to the chairs facing it. He sat, but his discomfort was palpable. This was my space, my authority, and he was the one asking for audience rather than granting it. The role reversal was clearly unsettling. "What can I do for you, Dad?" I kept my tone neutral, professional, the same voice I'd use with a colleague or client. He flinched slightly at the formality. "We need to talk about what's happening. Really talk, not these brief phone conversations where you shut down every attempt at discussion." The accusation in his voice was unmistakable, but I refused to take the bait. "I'm happy to talk. What specifically did you want to discuss?" He shifted in his chair, clearly having expected a different response. "You've moved out. You're refusing to come to family dinners. You won't even visit the house. Patricia is devastated, and I don't understand what we did that was so terrible it required this level of reaction." The framing was masterful in its dishonesty. By centering Patricia's feelings and questioning my reaction, he'd managed to avoid any acknowledgement of their actual behavior. I felt anger rise but kept it controlled, channeled into clarity rather than emotion. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly, leaning back in my chair with the casual confidence of someone who held all the power in the negotiation. "Patricia presented me with a bill for $1,200 a month to live in a house that's fully paid off. She itemized expenses that either don't exist or were wildly inflated. You sat there and supported her demands without question. And now you're confused about why I chose to live in my own home instead?" Donald's face flushed. "It wasn't like that. She was just trying to establish fair contribution from everyone in the household. You make a good salary, Rebecca. It's not unreasonable to expect you to chip in." The defense was predictable, almost word for word what he'd said before. He'd practiced this script with Patricia, had convinced himself it was reasonable, and now couldn't understand why I wasn't accepting the narrative. "You're right," I said, watching his expression shift to surprise at my agreement. "I do make a good salary. Good enough that I own a beautiful house in Lowry Hill, have substantial savings, and don't need to live anywhere I'm treated like an inconvenient tenant. So I'm exercising my options as a financially independent adult. Exactly what you and Patricia suggested I should do." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find a counter-argument that didn't expose the fundamental dishonesty of his position. "This isn't about money," he finally said, his voice dropping to something that might have been genuine distress. "You're my daughter. I don't want you cut out of my life over a disagreement about household expenses." The statement would have been more convincing if he'd led with it rather than saving it for when other tactics had failed. "I'm not cutting you out," I said, keeping my voice gentle despite the anger still simmering beneath my professional composure. "I'm living in my own home. You're welcome to visit anytime. We can have dinner, go to lunch, maintain whatever relationship you want. But I'm not moving back into a house where I'm treated as a financial obligation rather than family." Donald leaned forward, his hands clasped together in a gesture that looked almost like pleading. "Patricia didn't mean it that way. She's just used to running things efficiently, and she thought creating a formal system would prevent any misunderstandings or resentment down the line. She was trying to be fair." The explanation was so divorced from reality I almost laughed. "Dad, she presented me with a contract to sign. She calculated rent for a house that has no mortgage. She made it abundantly clear that my presence was tolerated only if I paid for the privilege. That's not fairness. That's hostility dressed up in spreadsheet formatting. His face crumpled slightly, and for a moment I saw the father I'd known before Patricia entered the picture. The man who'd comforted me through my mother's death, who'd been genuinely happy at my wedding, who'd called regularly after Michael died to make sure I was eating and sleeping and surviving. That man was still in there somewhere, buried beneath layers of conflict avoidance and misplaced loyalty. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly, the question carrying weight that went beyond surface meaning. He was asking how to fix this, how to bridge the gap that had opened between us, how to restore something that maybe couldn't be restored. I considered the question carefully. Part of me wanted to demand he choose between Patricia and me, force him to demonstrate whose relationship mattered more. But I was old enough, wise enough, to know that ultimatums rarely produce the outcomes we hoped for. More often, they just entrenched people in defensive positions and destroyed whatever goodwill remained. "I want you to acknowledge that what happened was wrong," I said finally, laying out the truth without embellishment or accusation. Not dismiss it as a misunderstanding or try to justify it as reasonable household management. Just acknowledge that presenting your widowed daughter with a rental agreement 6 months after her husband's death was hurtful and inappropriate. The silence that followed was heavy with everything he didn't want to admit. I could see the internal struggle playing across his face, the war between his desire to make peace and his unwillingness to criticize Patricia, even when criticism was deserved. "Things could have been handled better," he said finally, the concession so minimal it barely qualified. "Patricia can be blunt. She doesn't always consider how her efficiency might come across to people who are more emotionally driven." The statement managed to be both an excuse for Patricia and an insult to me, suggesting my objection to being charged rent in my childhood home was an emotional overreaction rather than a legitimate response to mistreatment. I felt the last thread of hope for real reconciliation snap. "Thank you for stopping by," I said, standing to signal the meeting was over. "I appreciate you taking the time to come downtown. But I think we've said everything that needs saying." Donald stood as well, confusion and frustration warring in his expression. "That's it? You're just done?" The question carried hurt, but also anger, as if my refusal to accept his non-apology was somehow the greater offense. "I'm not done," I corrected gently. "I'm your daughter, and I'll always be your daughter. But I'm also a grown woman with my own home, my own life and my own boundaries. You can respect those boundaries and we'll maintain a relationship. Or you can keep trying to convince me that my legitimate grievances are emotional overreactions, and we'll maintain distance. The choice is yours." I walked to the door and opened it, the gesture unmistakable in its finality. Donald moved slowly, reluctantly, pausing in the doorway as if searching for words that might salvage the situation. But whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. He simply nodded once and walked out, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Jennifer appeared moments later, her expression sympathetic but unsurprised. That looked difficult. I leaned against my desk, suddenly exhausted. He came here wanting me to apologize for being hurt, to accept that Patricia's behavior was reasonable, and to move back into a situation that was making me miserable. When I wouldn't do any of those things, he left frustrated that I'm being stubborn. She crossed her arms, her voice firm with conviction. "You're not being stubborn. You're being sane. There's a difference." The distinction mattered more than she probably realized. Stubbornness implied irrational inflexibility. Sanity was self-preservation, the basic requirement of knowing when to walk away from situations that damaged your well-being. I'd been sane, possibly for the first time in months. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of distraction, my mind replaying the conversation with Donald and analyzing every statement for hidden meanings or missed opportunities. By the time I left the office, twilight was settling over the city, the skyline lighting up against darkening sky. I drove home through Friday evening traffic, grateful for the time alone to process everything that had happened. The house welcomed me with warmth and familiar spaces, evidence of the life I was slowly rebuilding. I made dinner, poured wine, and settled into the evening with the comfortable routine of someone who belonged exactly where she was. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda asking how the week had gone. I typed back a brief summary, grateful for the connection, for the reminder that family was what you built as much as what you were born into. Saturday morning brought unexpected sunshine. The kind of brilliant winter day that made even below zero temperatures feel tolerable. I spent the morning organizing the house, finding places for the last of the boxes I'd moved from my father's place, making the space feel more lived in and less like a shrine to the past. The work was physical and satisfying. Each completed task a small victory over inertia and grief. Around noon my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a flutter of anxiety suggested it might be my father coming for round 2 of yesterday's unsuccessful conversation. But when I opened the door, Jennifer stood on the porch holding a bag from my favorite bakery and 2 cups of coffee. "Surprise," she said with a grin. "I figured you could use some company and carbohydrates." The gesture was so unexpected and so perfect that I felt tears prick my eyes. "You didn't have to do this." She pushed past me into the warmth of the house. "I know I didn't have to. I wanted to. Plus, I've been dying to see this place you keep talking about. Give me the full tour?" I showed her through the house, watching her admire the original woodwork and built-in details, explaining the various renovation projects Michael and I had tackled together. She asked thoughtful questions, noticed small touches, and never once made the conversation awkward by overemphasizing Michael's absence. We settled in the kitchen with coffee and pastries, and Jennifer finally voiced what I suspected had motivated the visit beyond simple friendship. "So your father came by yesterday. Want to talk about it?" I appreciated that she'd waited, that she hadn't led with the question but had instead given me the option to discuss or avoid as I preferred. He wanted me to admit I was overreacting and move back in. When I wouldn't, he left disappointed in my stubbornness. Jennifer made a derisive sound. "His loss. Seriously, Rebecca. Watching you this past week has been incredible. You've gone from someone who was just going through the motions to someone who actually seems to be living again. That's not stubbornness. That's recovery." The observation surprised me because I hadn't realized the change was so visible. "It's been hard," I admitted. "The house being back here without Michael, it's harder than I expected. But it's also right in a way that living with my father never was." She nodded, understanding without needing extensive explanation. "You needed space to grieve properly. You couldn't do that in someone else's house, especially when they were treating you like an unwelcome guest." The assessment was accurate enough that I didn't bother disagreeing. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking coffee and enjoying pastries that were probably destroying any pretense of healthy eating. "I've been thinking about something," Jennifer said finally, her tone suggesting she'd been considering this for a while. "You should host something here. A dinner party, game night, whatever feels comfortable. Invite the book club women, some neighbors, reclaim this space as somewhere that welcomes people rather than just housing memories." The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity. The house had been a gathering place when Michael was alive, a space where friends congregated and memories were made. Restoring that function would help transform it from memorial to home, would fill the rooms with new laughter and conversation that could coexist with older ghosts. "That's actually a great idea," I said, already considering logistics. "Maybe in a few weeks once I'm more settled. A casual dinner, nothing too formal." Jennifer's smile was triumphant. "I'll help with planning if you want. And I'll make sure you actually follow through instead of chickening out." The promise was both supportive and challenging. Exactly what I needed. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking and laughing, the conversation ranging from work gossip to book recommendations to her dating disasters. By the time she left, the house felt different. Less haunted, more inhabitable. As if her presence had helped exorcise some of the loneliness that had accumulated during months of absence. Sunday passed quietly, a day devoted to rest and reflection. I caught up on work emails, read for pleasure rather than book club obligation, and took a long walk through the neighborhood. The streets were busy with weekend activity, families building snowmen, couples walking dogs, the everyday normalcy of community life. I found myself noticing details I'd ignored for months. The house on the corner that had been repainted, the new coffee shop that had opened 2 blocks over, the way afternoon light caught on snow-covered trees. Monday morning, I met with Richard Bennett to finalize my updated estate planning. The documents he prepared reflected my current reality, rather than outdated assumptions about family loyalty. My primary beneficiary was now a combination of charitable organizations Michael and I had supported, with smaller bequests to friends who'd proven their worth through action rather than blood relation. My father was included, but not as the primary heir he might once have assumed he'd be. This looks exactly right, I said, reviewing the final versions. Thank you for making this happen so quickly. Richard smiled his understated lawyer smile. It's important to have these things in order. Life is unpredictable, and you want your wishes to be clear. The meeting concluded with signatures and notarizations, the ritual. Formality of legal documents now reflecting choices I'd made with full awareness, rather than default assumptions. That afternoon, I met with the property management company I'd selected after thorough research and interviews. Their representative, a competent woman named Diane, arrived prepared with comprehensive information about managing residential rentals. We discussed tenant screening, maintenance protocols, rent collection, and all the administrative details that would be necessary if I decided to move forward. The house would rent easily, Diane said after touring the property. Historic Victorian in Lowry Hill, fully renovated. This is exactly what young professionals and small families are looking for. We could probably get $2,800 a month, possibly more depending on included amenities. The figure was higher than I'd expected. Confirmation that Michael and I had built something truly valuable. I'm not quite ready to move forward yet, I said honestly, but I wanted to understand my options, to know what's possible if circumstances change. Diane nodded understanding. Take your time. When you're ready, we'll be here. And honestly, from a market perspective, there's no rush. Good properties in this neighborhood always find tenants. After she left, I stood in the living room considering possibilities. Renting the house would provide income while allowing me to maintain ownership. It would also free me from the daily confrontation with Michael's absence, giving me space to grieve without feeling like I was disrespecting his memory. But it would also mean letting strangers live in the space we created, trusting them with the results of our labor and love. The decision didn't need to be made immediately. For now, it was enough to know I had options, that I controlled my own future in ways that had felt impossible just weeks ago. Patricia and my father had tried to make me feel powerless, dependent, grateful for whatever scraps of tolerance they offered. Instead, I discovered reserves of strength I'd forgotten I possessed. The woman who'd walked into their house 6 months ago, shattered by loss and desperate for shelter, was gone. In her place was someone harder, wiser, and fundamentally unwilling to accept diminishment from anyone. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't experienced since before Michael's death. Work provided structure and intellectual engagement, the familiar challenges of client strategy and corporate problem-solving filling my days with purpose. Evenings were spent in the house, slowly transforming it from preserved memorial into functional home. I'd finally tackled the master bedroom, packing Michael's clothes with careful reverence and donating them to organizations he'd supported. His reading glasses went into a keepsake box along with his wedding ring and the watch I'd given him for our 20th anniversary. The room felt emptier afterward, but also breathable, as if releasing his physical belongings had somehow made space for his memory to exist without suffocating me. Book club became a monthly anchor, those Thursday evenings at various neighbors' homes providing connection and intellectual stimulation that reminded me I was more than just my grief or my professional achievements. The women in that circle knew about my father's situation now, not because I'd shared dramatic details but because Amanda had gently asked one evening and I'd given an honest answer. Their response had been practical support, rather than intrusive sympathy. Kate had shared her own story of family estrangement after her divorce. Lisa talked about setting boundaries with toxic relatives. The collective wisdom was clear. Sometimes loving yourself required disappointing people who'd taken your accommodation for granted. I hosted my first dinner party on a Saturday in late February, following through on Jennifer's suggestion with a determination that surprised even me. 8 people gathered around my dining room table, a mix of book club friends and neighbors I'd reconnected with since moving back. Jennifer came with her boyfriend, a software engineer who made her laugh and treated her with obvious affection. The evening was filled with good food, better wine, and the kind of easy conversation that happens when people genuinely enjoy each other's company. At one point, standing in my kitchen while refilling wine glasses, I caught myself smiling without conscious effort. The realization was startling. Somewhere in the past months, joy had become possible again. My father called occasionally, Brief conversations that maintained minimal contact without addressing the fundamental rift between us. He'd ask about work, about the house, about whether I needed anything. I'd respond with polite updates and reciprocal questions about his life. Patricia was never mentioned by either of us, her presence in our interactions like a ghost we'd agreed to pretend didn't exist. The calls felt performative, both of us going through motions of family connection without any genuine intimacy. But they maintained a thread, thin and fragile, that suggested the relationship wasn't completely severed. Spring arrived gradually, the way it always does in Minnesota, with false starts and sudden reversals before finally committing to warmth. I spent weekends working in the garden Michael and I had planted years ago, clearing winter debris and preparing beds for new growth. The physical labor was meditative, my hands in soil connecting me to something fundamental and enduring. Neighbors would stop to chat while I worked, offering plant divisions and gardening advice, welcoming me back into the community rhythms I'd abandoned. One Saturday morning in early April, while I was deadheading tulips along the front walk, a car pulled up that I recognized immediately. My father's sedan, conspicuous in its careful maintenance and outdated style. He emerged slowly, looking uncertain in a way that was unfamiliar. Donald had always carried himself with confidence bordering on arrogance, secure in his place in the world. The man approaching my garden looked diminished somehow, hesitant in a way that suggested he wasn't sure of his welcome. "Hello, Rebecca," he said, stopping at the edge of the garden bed as if afraid to trespass further. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I stood, brushing soil from my hands, taking a moment to assess the situation before responding. "You're not interrupting. Just doing some spring cleanup." The conversation felt stilted, formal, two people who should have been comfortable with each other instead navigating carefully around unspoken tensions. He gestured toward the house, toward the garden, taking in the evidence of habitation and care. "The place looks good. You've been taking care of it." The observation felt like it carried more weight than simple commentary on yard maintenance. "I have," I said simply. "It's my home. Want it to reflect that." We stood in awkward silence for a moment before he finally spoke what he'd apparently come to say. "Patricia and I are separating. She's moved out. The house is being sold." The announcement was so unexpected I actually felt my jaw drop slightly before I recovered my composure. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it despite everything. Divorce was painful regardless of the circumstances, and my father was facing upheaval in his 70s when most people hoped for stability. He shook his head, his expression carrying something that looked like relief mixed with regret. "Don't be sorry. It's been coming for a while. She wanted a lifestyle I couldn't sustain, expectations I couldn't meet. The household budgets, the constant accounting, it wasn't about fairness. It was about control. I finally saw that." The admission hung between us, as close to an apology as Donald seemed capable of offering. He was acknowledging, in his indirect way, that I'd been right about Patricia, that her treatment of me had been part of a larger pattern of manipulation and power plays. "What will you do?" I asked, genuinely curious about his plans. "Where will you go?" He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight in a way that suggested embarrassment. "I was hoping we could talk about that. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after how things went, but I wanted you to know what was happening, and to tell you that I'm sorry. For all of it. For choosing comfort over defending you, for letting Patricia treat you the way she did, for being a coward when you needed a father." The apology was more complete than anything he'd offered before, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly. This wasn't reconciliation, wasn't erasure of harm done, but it was acknowledgement. It was Donald finally taking responsibility for choices he'd made and damage those choices had caused. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly. "It matters." He nodded, relief evident in the easing of tension across his shoulders. "I don't expect you to forgive me immediately or maybe ever, but I'm hoping we can rebuild something. Not what we had before, maybe something different but still real." I considered his words carefully, weighing what I wanted against what felt possible. Complete estrangement had never been my goal. I'd simply needed him to see me, to acknowledge that his choices had consequences, to understand that love without respect was worthless. He seemed to have arrived at that understanding, even if it had taken the collapse of his marriage to get there. I'd like that, I said finally. Rebuilding, I mean. But it has to be on the foundation of honesty and boundaries. No more choosing someone else's comfort over basic decency toward me. He agreed immediately, eagerly, as if afraid I might retract the offer. We talked for another hour, standing in my garden while spring sun warmed our backs. He told me about the unraveling of his marriage, Patricia's increasing demands, and his growing recognition that he'd been manipulated. I shared carefully edited versions of my own recovery, the work of learning to live alone, the community I'd rebuilt. We didn't resolve everything, didn't erase months of hurt with one conversation. But we established a starting point, a foundation from which something new might eventually grow. When he finally left, we hugged briefly, awkwardly, two people still learning how to be family to each other again. The following Monday, Jennifer appeared in my office with an expression I'd learned meant significant news. "Your assistant title no longer feels adequate," she announced. "I've been with you 8 years, I basically run your professional life, and I think it's time for a promotion to chief of staff. With appropriate salary adjustment, obviously." The declaration was so perfectly Jennifer, direct and unapologetic, that I couldn't help but laugh. "You're absolutely right. Draft a proposal and I'll take it to senior management. You've earned it 10 times over." Her grin was triumphant. "Already drafted. Just needed your approval before submitting." She handed me a document that outlined her expanded responsibilities, her contributions to client relationships, and a compelling case for why the promotion served the firm's interests. It was thorough, professional, and entirely convincing. "This is excellent work," I said, genuinely impressed though not surprised. "Consider it approved. And Jennifer? Thank you. For everything. This past year would have been impossible without you." She waved off the gratitude with characteristic deflection. "You'd have figured it out. You're tougher than you think. But I'm glad I could help." That afternoon, I submitted her promotion proposal with my strongest recommendation. By the end of the week, it was approved, making official what had been functionally true for years. Jennifer wasn't just my assistant. She was my partner in managing the professional demands that allowed me to function, and she deserved recognition for that contribution. Summer arrived in full force, transforming Minneapolis into the kind of paradise that made residents forget how brutal the winters were. I spent evenings on my front porch, reading and watching neighborhood life unfold. My father visited occasionally, always calling first, never overstaying his welcome. We were rebuilding slowly, carefully, learning who we were to each other without Patricia's interference or my mother's memory mediating every interaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest in ways our relationship had never quite been before. Book club continued, the rhythm of monthly gatherings providing structure and connection. I'd become close with several of the women, particularly Amanda and Kate, relationships that had deepened beyond casual neighborly acquaintance into genuine friendship. They'd supported me through the worst of my grief and family conflict without judgment or intrusion, simply being present in ways that mattered. One Thursday evening in July, gathered at my house for our meeting, Amanda raised a glass in an impromptu toast. "To Rebecca," she said, "for showing us all that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself." The sentiment was simple but profound, and I felt tears prick my eyes even as I smiled. This room full of women, gathered in the house Michael and I had built, represented everything I'd almost lost and then fought to reclaim. Community, connection, the right to occupy space without apology or explanation. Patricia had tried to make me small, to reduce my worth to numbers on a spreadsheet. Instead, she'd accidentally pushed me toward rediscovering my own strength. My father's betrayal had hurt, but it had also clarified exactly who I wanted to be, and what kind of relationships I would accept going forward. As autumn approached and the air began carrying hints of coming cold, I found myself content in ways I hadn't anticipated being possible so soon after Michael's death. The grief would always remain, but it no longer consumed every moment. I could remember him with love rather than just aching loss, could honor what we'd built while also building something new. The house was mine now, fully and completely, filled with memories but not trapped by them. I'd survived loss and betrayal, had rebuilt from foundations I'd forgotten I possessed. And in rebuilding I'd discovered something essential. My worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition. It had always been mine to claim, as solid and enduring as the Victorian house I called home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.